this event. As I've said to many of you, we are the regulators. As you know, we're the regulators of the Gaming Commission, and we're now also the regulators of the racing industry. But in addition to being regulators of the racing industry, we consider ourselves partners with the racing industry. We have a job to do as regulators, and we will do it rigorously, but we also are invested in trying to figure out with you all how this industry can be sustained. An industry with a tremendous tradition in Massachusetts, and an industry that, independent of the gaming licensing issues, we would like to help find a way to prosper and be successful. So, as you know, led by Dr. Jennifer Durenberger, our Director of Racing, we have undertaken a host of steps to try to rethink the industry, rethink the regulatory environment, rethink the safety medication issues, rethink the structure, rethink the organization of payouts, the whole business, and begin to think about what we can do once the licensing decisions are made, gaming licensing decisions are made. How can we put ourselves in a position to be ready to have a successful horse racing industry after that later on is worked out? This forum is one of many, many steps in that process to get us the information and to build a strategy that can sustain horse racing in Massachusetts for a long, long time. So I thank you again for coming. I thank our guests from out of town for flattering us with your presence here. I thank our director, Jennifer Durenberger, who has been terrific, as you all know, and I look forward to an edifying session. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. And welcome to everyone in the room. We hope this is the first of what will be many annual horse racing forums. As a racing aficionado, I would hope that this would be the first of several semi-annual forums. But I want to thank you all for coming. And I know that the stakeholders in the room, on both sides, you've got busy schedules, not just today, but every week, every month. So we really appreciate, thank you on the microphone. So we appreciate you making the time to be here. I also want to thank this morning's speakers, who, when we reached out to them not very long ago, kind of last minute notice, they each agreed within minutes to join us here today. And I think that that speaks volumes to the commitment of our industry's leaders. Both breed organizations are in the immediate run-up to their respective national and international and end-of-season world championships. So for them to be here today is a big deal as well. We have two goals for today's sessions. For the morning session, we are hoping to educate audience members on the general state of the horse racing industry as it stands in the country. I'm a firm believer that as the nation goes, so the local industry goes. It certainly informs the issues that we face here. We'd also like to enhance our commission's developing understanding of our industry, and I'm delighted that all 5 of them are here today. That's fantastic. For the first session here, we have chief executives from both the thoroughbred, or running horse as we call it in Massachusetts, and standardbred, or harness horse registries, to describe the state of their breeds. We've also got members of the National Thoroughbred Racing Association, and we're going to set that national stage for you. In the afternoon session, our goal is to have open and honest dialogue about the state of the industry in the Commonwealth at what is really a critical time, as the chair said. Just about all of our stakeholders, from the operators to the breeders to owners and trainers, to the racing division. We're all attempting to make our business plans for the next year and beyond in the face of some pretty significant unknowns. So to the extent we can all be on the same page about what is knowable, when it is knowable, the parties can be as informed as possible as they make their decisions going forward. More about that this afternoon. First, this morning, I would like to welcome Mr. Matt IULIANO. Matt is the Executive Vice President and Executive Director of the Jockey Club. This is the breed registry for all thoroughbred horses in North America. The organization is dedicated to the improvement of thoroughbred breeding and racing and fulfills that mandate through its subsidiaries, strategic partnerships, and charitable foundations. The Jockey Club provides support to a broad range of industry initiatives, many focused on the safety of both horse and rider. Mr. Iuliano moved into his current position with the Jockey Club in 2010 after 8 years of service as the Vice President of Registration Services. Prior to that, he served in several executive capacities with Churchill Downs. Mr. Iuliano has a whole lot of letters after his last name, holding a bachelor's degree in agriculture, and a master's in physiology and biophysics, an MBA, and a law degree.
Wow.
Welcome, Mr. Iuliano.
Thank you. And thank you for extending this invitation to us to address the Gaming Commission. We always welcome these opportunities to discuss our shared interests and our passions that we have for this sport, along with our friends and fellow advocates. Is this?
That's not it.
I could talk about this, but I probably shouldn't.
How about escape? Somewhere in the background is probably your presentation.
Let's see.
I talk fast, so we're a minute ahead of schedule already.
I don't see it.
Help is on the way.
Is that right? Oh, good.
It might be in there somewhere.
Is there a presentation?
There's not a PowerPoint there that I can find, unless it's under that under originals.
What's its name?
It's Massachusetts.
I have a lot of good
Racing.
racing jokes, but they're almost all off color, so I'm going to spare you from that.
Yeah, you're broadcast
Although
live
I've
on
got
the
a great
web.
audience for it, right?
Very good.
All right.
There it is.
On the slideshow, I think will be good.
Doesn't want to accept the spelling of his name. Huh?
Perfect. Thank you.
Good job.
Today, I'd like to cover a couple of topics with you. The first is recent trends in breeding and racing and the interaction that these two important segments have on our industry for fueling growth. And then secondly, I'd like to update you on a number of our growth initiatives that we've recently undertaken to competitively position horse racing for long-term sustainable growth. And more importantly, I want to discuss the vital role that we believe medication reform plays in achieving that long-term sustainable growth. Let's start with with the breeding end of it first. So after more than a decade where the number of foals registered each year varied by at most a couple of thousand, 2005 marked the modern era peak at 38,400 registered foals, which is the numbers here depicted in blue. From that high water mark, the registered foals have declined by nearly 40%, with the 2014 foal crop estimated at 22,000. These are levels that we have not seen since 1967. The year of foaling for the winner of the eventual 1970 Kentucky Derby Dust Commander, and also the year when Kelso was inducted into the Hall of Fame. And I think for the locals, it also marks the year after the Beatles played one of their final concerts in Massachusetts in the infield at Suffolk Downs. The decline in registered foals obviously indicates a decline in broodmare population as well, as shown here in red. From a high point of around 60,000 mares bred in 2004 that produced the 2005 foal crop, this year 34,200 mares were reported bred that will result in an estimated 22,000 foals next year. As shown here in green, the number of stallions in production has been trending downward. And if we extend this back into the peaks of foal production that occurred back in the mid-'80s, when over 50,000 thoroughbred foals were registered, the decline in the number of stallions in production has consistently trended downward. Even as the foal crop remained relatively stable during the periods of time between 1995 and 2005, the number of stallions have trended slightly downward each year. Now, in order to maintain the foal crops, average book size has increased on a commensurate level, which indicates the popularity of some of the more commercially and economically popular stallions. On the racing side of the equation, it pretty much mirrors the events that are occurring on the breeding side. And this is information that's taken from our fact book that's available online at jockeyclub.com. But not unlike the foal crop, after an extended period where the number of starters, shown here in blue, only varied by a few thousand between 2009 and 2012, the number of thoroughbreds that started in a race declined by nearly 15%. Shown here in red and green, the number of races and the number of starts have paralleled these downward trends, with starters, races, and starts declining anywhere from 14 to 17%. The math would tell us that starts per starter and the average field size must have remained relatively constant, and that's certainly the case. Starts per starter declined by just over 2% during this period of time, and actually they've started to trend upwards slightly, started in 2010, and field size has declined by just a little over 3%. So what happens when we extend these trends into the future? Looking at the historical information is always useful, but obviously for purposes of us in this room today, as we plan future courses of action, whether it's from a business strategic aspect or regulatory aspect, when we pull these trends forward, what do we see? Well, Equibase recently presented the results of various models at the TRA's simulcast convention in Lexington. Building upon estimates of the foal crop, Equibase estimated a handful of key racing metrics 3 years from now under a particular set of assumptions. First, declines in horses of racing age are based upon a very fundamental driver, and that's the foal crop. And the foal crop is something we know with a fairly high degree of certainty. So once that number is obtained, other mathematical relationships that exist between starts per starter, the number of horses that are entering racing as 2-year-olds and 3-year-olds the first time, it becomes a very useful exercise in modeling out racing. The blue line represents the total population of thoroughbreds that are of racing age and are available at any given time or during any given year. So that's basically the universe of horses, the universe of thoroughbreds that are available to race based on registration figures. Second is an estimate of the total number of race days, with a race day defined as the sum of all races that are held in the United States and Canada. So much like man hours or man days, race days are simply the total number of days over the total number of racetracks that are currently in operation. So for background, if we look at these numbers, the assumptions that are made here would include that the population of horses that are available for racing will decline according to the estimates of the foal crop, and then at least in the short term, the number of race days will remain relatively flat, which is about what they've done. They have trended downward, but for the most part have remained relatively flat. So that's the background assumptions, and now let's look at some of the key metrics. When we estimate the number of starters that are available to start a race using foal crop estimates and holding the proportion of starters by age category constant, the number of starters could decline by as many as 20,000 horses in 3 years. Now, assuming that these historical relationships between field size and the number of races continue to hold, a reduction in starters would reduce the average number of starters per race by close to 2 full horses. And that's, again, all tied back to the initial foal crop estimate and then holding constant those mathematical relationships that have proven to be very stable over time. Now, alternatively, assuming that field size continues to hold at historical numbers and starts per starter remain relatively flat, to maintain these levels of activity, the number of races would need to decline from an estimated 50,000 in 2013 nationally down to around 35,000 in 2015 in order to keep the same level of competitiveness in the fields that are going to the track. Now, it's important to understand that obviously these numbers are numbers that have been modeled, and they're based upon several assumptions. Those of you in the audience that have been involved in these exercises, as you vary assumptions, clearly it can create different results. We've conducted sensitivity analysis on a number of these assumptions in order to look at the range or the confidence levels that we can have in some of those estimates, but suffice it to say that the relationship is fairly simple. When the number of foals registered go down, the competitiveness of the fields, the number of races, field size, et cetera, are likewise could be expected to go down as well. So with the certainty of an estimated foal crop for 2014 at 22,000 foals, adjustments to these key assumptions, all these models are going to point eventually to fewer races in our future, in our immediate future. And those declines will have an impact on handle and consequently on purses as well. So that's kind of the negative news. That's kind of where we're at. What are we seeing? What are the trends? And again, there are some assumptions that are built in when you look at forecasting these numbers forward. But let's see what kind of conclusions this will draw. With all other things held constant, fewer horses will ultimately lead to fewer races, as we've discussed. And with fewer races out there, the importance of quality and scheduling to maximize exposure to the market are critical for maximizing revenue. In fact, this is one of the strategic initiatives we have been executing upon for the past couple of years. One of our commercial subsidiaries, Encompass Solutions, has developed a scheduling tool to assist racetracks in scheduling their biggest races to maximize revenues by minimizing the amount of cannibalistic overlaps that occur in race schedules. To better position racing for long-term growth, all of our work indicates racing has tremendous appeal on television. And our advisors tell us television is critical for developing new markets and extending the reach of horse racing. These were the motivations behind our recent partnership with Fox Sports 1 to position our best racing among their already impressive sports lineup. And that sports lineup that's emerging on this exciting new network already has a reach of 90 million homes coming out the gate. So providing existing and new owners with a one-stop resource for their information needs was the motivation behind our partnership with TOBA in developing OwnerView. Owners and introducing new owners are the lifeblood of this sport. It is inarguable that it is the owners who provide the majority of the capital that fuels the engine of commerce in our industry, from breeding to sales to racing, and back to breeding again when those horses re-enter production. OwnerView is there to assist owners in decision-making ranging from who to train their horse to how to get a license in a particular state. Our research indicated that each of these strategies, however, was affected by a very powerful undercurrent. It's an undercurrent that we noticed when we first did our comprehensive industry analysis a couple of years ago, and it reemerged again when we conducted additional surveys just this summer. And that is that racing, like any other business, must each day go out and win the confidence of our customers and continually improve the public's perception of our sport. The surveys we conducted a couple of years ago as part of that larger industry analysis, in addition to surveys conducted earlier by the NTRA and even more recent surveys this summer, have all told us that efforts to grow the business would be tempered somewhat if the public's confidence in the integrity, animal welfare, and safety record of the sport was shaken in any way. So this past summer, we asked the premier marketing research and consulting firm Penshone Berlin to update surveys that were conducted as part of a comprehensive analysis we did in 2011. With the help of Jeff Platt at Hanna and Jerry Brown at Thorograph, we gained insight into the factors and motivations that shape preferences and buying behaviors among our sport's most committed fans. Here's what they discovered. 4 of 5 of those fans who wager in excess of $10,000 per month list drugs and takeout as very important in their decisions. And again, these are just the factual background. 8 of 10 consider illegal drugs when betting certain tracks and states. 3 of 4 avoid betting certain tracks and states because of these perceptions, and I think it's important to point out that the term perception. We've all heard the term or the phrase about perception being reality. Obviously, many of these things are simply based on open surveys and asked for the respondents to give their honest and candid answers to these types of questions. And invariably, they have these perceptions that have already been planted in their head, and those perceptions have affected the way that they conduct their business. 91% of them want uniform medication rules across all jurisdictions, and they want that immediately. So these are our most devoted fans. Excuse me. That is, as the economists would say, they vote every day for their preferences with their wallets. Interestingly, we saw the same results a couple of years ago in our larger industry analysis when it comes to new fans and potential fans entering the sport. Those responsible for growing our sport from where it is now to where we'd like to take it. But interestingly, these data confirm those same preferences exist and the same perceptions now. The perceptions are at work in the minds of our most committed fans, those that are responsible for sustaining our sport. And when we see data like this and we see results like this, it represents opportunity for us to investigate and to develop strategies in order to reverse those perceptions. So all the data point to the importance of medication reform and uniformity and the role that that plays in positioning our industry for long-term sustainable growth. I do want to thank you for extending this opportunity to allow us to share some of this data with you. We applaud Massachusetts in taking the leadership position that they have in medication reform, and at the Jockey Club, we've been working diligently with a number of regulatory authorities around the nation to follow your lead. Thank you.
Matt, before you sit down, did the commissioners have any questions of you? We've got plenty of time. I built in about 5 minutes for interaction with the individual speakers, and then we'll have 15 minutes for a roundtable at the end. But did any of you have questions for Mr. Iuliano?
Yes.
Where is the pushback on a uniform set of medication rules? Where is that coming from? It's there.
I don't know if I would necessarily point to a single issue, and we're fortunate to have the new chairman of the RMTC with us, who's actually my partner in this endeavor as we work towards national uniformity. But it's really difficult to point to any single source when you look at it. There's obviously a degree of caution involved with any type of regulatory change, just because of the magnitude and the sheer volume of the amount of change that's required in order to pull all states into similar alignment. So you'll see that, and let's just tag it as cautionary. Perhaps it's an abundance of or overabundance of caution at that point. Probably the second area is there is some degree of parochialism. It's hard to avoid. Most of us who've been in this business for a number of years have seen that type of a very regional, a very local approach to regulatory or to the regulation of horse racing based on a unique set of circumstances within that jurisdiction. We've spent a great deal of time within the RMTC and within a number of the safety committees that we host and that we provide support for, studying those very issues to see if there are things at the core, fundamentally, that would support some type of regional preference or regional need for a particular set of rules. So far, we've been unable to identify those. So I think the efforts that we've spent a great deal of time on in the past couple of months, at least with the Jockey Club in supporting the RMTC and supporting the RCI in this initiative, is educational. It's really to sit down one-on-one with regulators, lay all the data out on one side, lay out their existing rules on the other, and then do what's, excuse me, what's referred to as a classic gap analysis. Here's the gaps that exist between the regs.
Go ahead.
Other than adopting the uniform medication,
Mike.
other than adopting the uniform, medication policies, are there other things that can change that perception? Other steps, if you're one of those states, for example, that happens to be in that situation where there's a perception that you're, and the bettors do not feel comfortable, is there something else?
I think one of the undercurrents throughout a number of the surveys is the need for transparency. It's interesting that not only the new fans that are entering into the sport, but even the existing fans ask for more transparency. And for those of us with Mike and Alex, Jennifer, myself up here, when you drill into those kind of questions, transparency is a hard thing to define. What's it mean? Is it to the level of testing? Is it to the level of information that's provided in the program on particular horses? It's a very expansive universe that we're attempting to put our arms around right now as it relates to transparency. But if I had to say there was one element that seems to stitch together all that, it's that the people that we've talked to that participated in these types of surveys have said, we want your sport to be more transparent. We want to be able to see into it. We want to know what is the horse, and it's not necessarily a horse-specific issue. Horses, jockeys, owners, trainers, etc., regulatory rulings for that matter. And I think what it tells us is the more information we provide to the marketplace, they seem to respond to it.
Those actual and projected drops in foals and all the things that cause the drop in foals and all the consequences of the drop in foals are really precipitous. That's a huge, rapid drop. We've talked a little bit about this in sort of general terms, but how do you describe what's happened? I mean, what has happened in the industry that's caused this drop to be so incredibly precipitous?
Gosh, I wish this almost reminds me of the 2008 financial issues. If
Yeah.
I could have only predicted that.
Right.
But I think there's probably a number of factors that contributed to this decline that we're seeing, at least from the breeding side of it. And we're also seeing a lot of recovery signs, though, on that end of it. When you look at the recent auction results, for example, at some of the larger auction companies around the country and even internationally, we're starting to see some very, very positive signs of recovery on it. But I think if you had to factor out those issues that played the biggest role in that, I think there was a rush into the business when you looked at some of the numbers, the registration numbers that occurred, and when you looked at mares in production. We spent a great deal of time back in 2006, 2007, where we actually kind of peeled back the covers of those 60, 65,000 mares that were in production at that time and tried to do an assessment of quality on those horses. In other words, why are those mares being bred? When you look at the quality of their pedigrees, the quality of their race records themselves, and you looked at the stallions that they're being bred to. And as the breed registry, we're kind of uniquely positioned because we do offer a number of products, production indices, so to speak, that you can apply to these horses and say, how does horse A compare to horse B, state A compare to state B? And in that analysis, we concluded that there were large bands of horses where we couldn't attribute anything other than perhaps exuberance, perhaps expectations, perhaps speculation in terms of those mares being in production. Now, when you follow them through, you look at the foals, where did the foals wind up, how many of them went through public auction, who started a race. It wasn't surprising to see that out of that kind of band of horses that we would never say perhaps are more speculative in their nature, at least their breeding decision was more speculative. When you follow those horses through, you didn't see a lot of result in the foal. They either didn't go through a sale, they didn't start in a race. Many of them, and a number of them didn't re-enter the breeding shed either. So it represent that population of horses that you simply lose track of. So taken in its totality, you stand back from those long-term trends and look at it, I would have to say the majority of that decline was when kind of the economic reality caught up with some of the economic expectations that were placed on those mares when they were originally placed into production the first time. This is a business that's very, very competitive in the marketplace. And so if a mare's produce record doesn't substantiate her being in production after a few years, you start seeing those horses removed from production. You start seeing the kind of declines we did. Now, interestingly, we've gone back and revisited that analysis, and we've discovered that, again, those same kind of indices, the mare produce index and so forth, those same kind of indices have responded very positively. as mares were taken out of production and didn't return to the breeding shed for covers, the quality, the overall quality of the breeding herd has gone up tremendously. It's always hard to, you know, for us as a breed registry to say a good horse versus a bad
No, I
horse.
understand.
But
Right.
again,
Right.
using those types of production indices that a lot of consigners, buyers, et cetera, use, those numbers have trended northward. So that tells us that the horses that are out there in production now are good economic risks.
That was absolutely not the answer that I expected. So in a supply and demand problem, what you're saying is the issue here was an oversupply rather than a declining demand. I thought I would have expected that what you were going to talk about was why has demand declined, and that the supply responded to a declining demand. But that's not what you said at all.
Yeah, what's interesting is when you look at the percentage of the foal crop that actually went, or actually the raw numbers of foals that went and started in their first race as 2-year-olds and 3-year-olds, those numbers are fairly consistent. What we did see throughout that period of time, though, is that the number of horses entering racing the first time as 2-year-olds went down. Now, it was either because they weren't a good risk, and simply the owners didn't want to take the risk of putting the horses into training, or it could be that after the second or third foal out of a mare with perhaps a less than stellar produce record, I think the speculation ground to a halt on that, and that mare was removed. It's rather interesting when you look at one of the key indicators that we watch very carefully is the number of races, just how many races are run in the United States. It's always hovered around 50 to 60,000 or so. And throughout a lot of this correction, or throughout a lot of this decline, you'll see that tracks have responded. They have changed their inventory of races that they offer, but for the most part, they haven't responded to the same degree that we would expect them to respond as it relates to the decline in the foal crop. So what that's telling us, with the field size still remaining relatively static, is that demand's still there. I think from the customer standpoint, that demand's still there.
But is it?
I'm sorry.
Yeah, I just want to follow up on that. Isn't also, at least in Massachusetts, the number of race days is a legislative requirement. And I suspect that may be also the case in other states. So when you aggregate the number of races holding steady, isn't there a disconnect in terms of, the point that you make with this fall declining?
Right. Well, the way these assumptions were modeled too is, and maybe I didn't do a very clear job of explaining it, but there's some key variables that you have to assume in order to model the future, to look at these predictive figures. One of those key estimates that you have to look at is to ask yourself the question: if you hold race days constant and field size constant, what's that going to do to starts per starter, underlying starts per starter, which likewise is going to have an effect on the total number of starts, which drives handle purses, et cetera. Now, because there's so many variables, there's more than 2 variables that are involved in that equation. The other way to look at it is turn it on its head and say, well, what would happen? What's required to happen to keep field size constant and to keep starts per starters constant? And the only other variable then that's left to change is race days.
Race days.
So yes, you're absolutely right. When you look at a number of the state regs, it's mandated. There's a certain number of race days that have to be run each year. So those 2 analytical approaches are really 2 ways of coming to the same point. And that is, there's going to be pressure. There's going to be pressure on number of race days. And without that pressure on race days, what could happen is you'll see changes in field size, or you'll see changes in starts per starter. One of those 3, either in concert or individually, would have to change.
Can I follow up on Steve's supply-demand question? Because none of this fascinating analysis mentioned attendance or total revenues. What are the trends in both of those, and do they have an impact on the decline in the foal crop?
Well, I'm a horse guy, and this guy right here is a people guy. And
So I should hold that question.
I would probably hold that question.
All right.
I mean, we look at it from the horse side of the equation, but from the consumer side of the equation, there's a whole nother analysis.
That's interesting. I would have thought they were connected, but
Well, they are. I mean, absolutely they are. And it's one of the things that we've done, at least if you look at the strategic initiatives that we've undertaken,
Right.
they've all been rather horse-centric. We
Right.
do have a media partnership with Fox Sports in order
Right.
to increase coverage. But when you look at safety and integrity initiatives, medication reform
Right.
initiatives, even things that date back as far as 2006, when we launched in an effort to improve safety plannings and injury mitigation strategies, launched things like the equine injury database
Right.
and so forth. Those were very horse-centric. As advocates for the horse, those are the areas that we wanted to focus upon. Our exposure on the consumer side of it, through surveys, through discussions, focus groups, et cetera, they've relayed to us some of those key factors that shape their preferences, principle of which being transparency, principle of which being what happens to the horse after he retires, what's the safety record, the overall safety record for both horse and rider, things of that sort. But how that translates, in other words, if you change on the supply side or on the safety side a factor of 0.2 as an example, what does that do to the dollars, to the demand dollars? We haven't done that.
thank you.
Time for one more question, and it'll be mine. Matt, thoroughbred racing is not just a national sport, but it's an international sport, and you've just come back from some meetings in Europe. What can you tell us about what the rest of the world says about racing in the United States?
Well, it's interesting. It's there's probably a number of conclusions that we can draw from those trips overseas. Principle of which is lessons that can be learned from human sports. When you look at human sports, there's been a great deal of interest now. Not necessarily, well, there's always been interest when the athlete competes, but there's interest in the period of time leading up to the competition. That has occupied a lot of attention. When you look at some of the large regulatory bodies that are responsible for human sports, what does the athlete do in training? What are some of the substances that the athlete's exposed to while in training, et cetera, et cetera. And it's principally a response to, I guess as a general term, you could call it the increased pharmacological sophistication of some of these substances. Whether that's true or perceived, again, it's hard to look at. Whether you can actually treat something months in advance and produce that effect at the time of the race. Obviously, there's some very clear examples that we have in racing, both human and horse, with EPO, for example. But suffice it to say that that area of training is attracting more interest. And internationally, the rest of the world is becoming very interested in what these horses are doing during that period of time. In fact, I think you may have all heard about the recent scandal I only call it a scandal because some of the newspapers that picked up on it over in London were interesting. But it was with anabolic steroids and the use of anabolic steroids in training. And it boils down to a fundamental question of, are we collectively as an industry sufficiently regulating at the time after the race in a post-race sample to ensure that those effects are gone? Now, whether it's anabolic steroids or whatever the latest biologically active peptide or substance is, that same model's in place. Are we doing the right thing? Are we doing a sufficient job in focusing our efforts post-race? And should we be also looking at periods of time pre-race? So that's probably one of the most interesting things that came out of it. From other aspects of it, the competitiveness of the horse. I always look at the auction results, and I always look at, although it's, you're looking at buyers that may not necessarily have a direct connect to the ultimate buyer of the horse, but it's interesting that I think there's still strong demand for the U.S. thoroughbred. The U.S. Thoroughbred is a good horse, is a very significant horse when it comes to international pedigrees.
Thank you.
Thank you very much. All right, next we have Mike Tanner. Mr. Tanner is Executive Vice President and Chief Executive Officer for the United States Trotting Association, which I think will be of interest to most of the audience this morning. The United States Trotting Association is not only the breed registry for the standardbred racehorse, it's also organized to provide administrative, rulemaking, and licensing services to its members, as well as promote the sport and business of harness racing. Mr. Tanner's been with USTA since 2008, following a 3-year stint as Director of Racing Operations at Harrah's Chester Casino and Racetrack. Along the way, he has worked in a variety of front office positions with Ladbroke, Gulfstream Park, Magna Entertainment, Breeders' Cup Limited, and participated in the National Thoroughbred Racing Association's Technology Group Communications Task Force. Mr. Tanner holds a degree in psychology, as well as an MBA. Thank you, Mr. Tanner.
All right, thank you. I think I've immediately shown how technologically savvy I am. So I'll beg your indulgence on this. And there we go. Let me just hit the space bar like I wanted. All right, very good. All right, good morning, everybody, and thank you very much for inviting me here. My name is Mike Tanner, as Director Durenberger said. I'm the Executive Vice President and CEO of the United States Trotting Association. We've been around since 1938, so we're celebrating our 75th anniversary. We are a membership-based organization, and our membership is comprised of drivers and trainers and other horsemen and racetracks and officials. Pretty much if you're involved in the sport of harness racing in any of those capacities, you're a member of our organization. Here's what we do. We license owners, trainers, drivers, and officials. We formulate rules. We maintain the records. Perhaps the biggest and most important job that we have is to serve as the breed registry. We promote the integrity of the industry and the humane treatment of standardbreds. I can talk a little bit later about some of those programs. And we publicize the sport of harness racing and the standardbred breed. We came about back in the late 30s. There were 4 or 5 governing bodies at the time involved in harness racing, and they figured that was probably about 3 or 4 too many. So there was a merger. The biggest one was located in Columbus. That was us. And so we wound up in that capacity. As state racing commissions developed and proliferated, our jurisdictional power waned. We really don't have any, except we oversee the fairs. But we have retained our role in doing the things that I just described. So I'm proud to say that we're looking forward, hopefully, to another 75 years. That said, here's what I'm going to do today. I'm going to walk you through some of the key metrics of the industry. It'll be the first part of the presentation. And then I'm going to talk to you a little bit about some of the state breeding programs that we've seen that have been very successful and have provided some bright spots in an industry that's seen its challenges over the past 25 or 30 years. And talk about some other things that are pertinent to the standardbred industry today, and then I'll welcome your questions. First slide that I have.
Are those inflation adjusted, or are those just?
No, those are actual numbers.
Absolute.
Yeah. Our trajectory as a sport in terms of handle mirrors that of my thoroughbred counterparts. You can see that those are actual numbers, handle numbers. Those are our total amount bet on harness racing in the United States from 1960 on. You can see that there was a pretty steady growth through the 60s into the 70s, and our sport peaked in 1980 at $2.8 billion in money bet on U.S. harness racing. It started to go down in 85, and then you can see a rather precipitous decline into 1990. The primary reason for that were the tax reform laws of 1986, I think. We saw people leaving the game, and as a result, field sizes shrunk a bit. I agree with what Matt was saying about how ownership is the lifeblood of our sport. Everything seems to flow off of that. It seems as if ownership numbers, as they've gone up or down, that's affected breeding numbers, that's affected handle numbers. It's all interrelated. We saw a brief bump up in the late 90s into 2000, and that really reflects the spread of full card simulcasting. What happened there is people had more signals and more opportunities to bet on harness racing and on horse racing, and the numbers showed that. And then we get into the most recent decade, the first decade of the 2000s, and you see some precipitous declines. I can tell you from having was in the position of running a racetrack in 2007, when the economy collapsed, it was like the numbers falling off a cliff. What we've been encouraged by, what doesn't show in there, is that we were up last year by a percentage point or two, and we're trending right now up about 4.5% as compared to same date in 2012. So we think that's stabilized and is coming back a bit. But those are the numbers that would reflect our business levels as an industry from 1960 to the present. This chart shows U.S. and North American purses and the number of races from 1986 to the present. Again, chose 1986 because that's when we first started to see changes. You see, we had a little over 80,000 races in 1986, and last year the number of races in the United States was 46,848. You'll notice purses, however, have gone up rather dramatically from 1986, and that is due almost entirely to casino gaming and the Racino model, which has proven very successful in several states. North America, that just includes races from Canada. I'm sure you're all familiar that Ontario's experienced quite a bit of upheaval in the past year or two, so you'll see some changes in those numbers. So our foal crop. In 1986, we had 23,000, a little more than 23,000. You can see then a decline over the years. Last year we were at 9,359. We are anticipated this year to be about 9,000, so a slight decrease. Where we're seeing, though, and we go state by state, we're seeing the states where there are incentives and where purses are strong. Those numbers have held pretty steady, and we've even seen some growth in some. In other states, and I was thinking about Michigan, for example, which in 1990 was one of the stronger spots in America for harness racing, and has just been decimated by the Indian casinos there, and by a relatively weak breeding program to where they're just hanging on. Those numbers, for example, have declined by, I think, about 80%. So it's kind of a tale of the haves and the have-nots. We've got some states where racing is thriving, and we've got some others where it's really suffering, and it's almost entirely due to what incentives are and are not in place for standardbred horsemen. This takes a look about where the racing is, standardbred racing in the United States. And you can see the two biggest states in my sport right now are New York and Pennsylvania. Both have the Racino model. They have many races. They have big purses. Illinois is still pretty important to us. The Chicago market is quite strong. And you can take a look, again, I was talking about, take a look at Michigan and you can see what I'm talking about. To where they're still there, but as compared to where they were, it's quite a difference. Indiana's been kind of a success story for us in the industry. Racino legislation was passed in 2007, and slot machines were introduced in April of 2008. 12% of slot revenue goes towards the horse racing industry. I think the standardbreds see 46% of that. Of that 12%, 46.5% goes to racing, 50% goes to breeder awards and incentives, and 3.5% goes to the Horsemen's Association for insurance and other administrative costs. You can see what happened in 2007. There were 1,807 mares bred, and then the year after the slots came into play, that number shot up over 50%, 2,737 mares bred. Registered foals from 2007 to 2009 went up 34.2%. And you can see our membership dropped a little bit and then came back last year, I think, as people are becoming more aware of what's happening in Indiana. Another interesting metric that we saw, the average sales price for an Indiana-bred yearling in 2007, I think, was $1,750, something like that. It was very small. It's more than tripled now. It's up over $5,000 in terms of the average sales price for Indiana breds. There's been a bit of a shift in that state. There were two venues hosting harness racing pari-mutually, Indiana Downs and Hoosier Park. They came to an agreement last year where now Hoosier has gone solely standardbred and Indiana Downs has gone solely thoroughbred. But the numbers continue to trend in a positive direction, and we're pretty excited about that. Similarly, Pennsylvania, and I can speak very closely to this because I ran the racing operations for Harris Chester from 2006 through 2008. The legislation was passed in 2004, and the machines came on board in January of 2007. Again, similar numbers here. Mare's bred went up 4.3%. The registered foals went up 18.9%. The average Pennsylvania bred yearling was selling for a little over $19,000 in 2007. By 2009, it was up to $26,000. And then you can see handle there going from 214 million down to 166, and then shooting back up to 226. Should mention the difference from 2005, we added a track, went from 2 tracks to 3, but that was in 2006. So the numbers from 8 and 12 are apples to apples, and the handle is trending there. When I started at Harris Chester back in 2005, the place was a hole in the ground, literally a hole. We were still building the track. We got up and running in 2006. And we had trouble filling our entry box. We were offering daily purses, I think, of about $60,000 a day, which was decent, but the breeders' incentives weren't quite in place yet. And so we might have, for a 12 or 13 race card, I might get 120 horses in the entry box. The following year, with the breeders' incentives and the sales had started to pick up and the purses had shot up, we would card 13 or 14 races, and I'd have 280 to 300 horses in the box each day. We were turning people away because the incentive was there to where they wanted to race. What I started seeing also was that people from New Jersey, horsemen from New Jersey, Delaware, out of state, were coming into Pennsylvania, and they were buying up residences because they wanted to be based there to qualify for the incentive awards. And so we were kind of excited about that. We also, despite the fact that if you take a look at the USTA numbers, which showed declines nationally, especially at that time, happening rather rapidly, we were seeing lapsed members get back into the game as well. People who had owned horses back in the 70s or the 80s, but perhaps couldn't afford to stay in or had gotten out for any number of reasons. We found them coming back in. A lot of times they were coming back in partnerships. But they were getting back into the game. So that's some anecdotal information. I don't have a slide for New York, but that's another jurisdiction that has done awfully well with its breeders program. Again, Racino came online there, I think, in 2006 or 2007, and racing in New York had really been struggling at that point. The sire stakes money, however, has made it such that they are now a key racing center in the standardbred industry. They gave away $12.1 million in sire stakes money last year. Their Excelsior Series was another $3.8 million, and they divided it into 2 categories: performance-based, which is what happened on the racetrack, so it was more directed towards an owner, and then there was a residency bonus that was more breeder-centric. One of the neat metrics also, and again, coming from a racetrack management background, there are a couple of things that jump out at me that kind of indicate the health of various racing programs. Activity at the claim box, are people buying horses? And in New York, there were 561 claims in 2005. Last year, there were over 1,000. In Pennsylvania, the year or two before the Racino legislation fueled purses and fueled the breeding industry, I think there were 330 claims. Last year, there were 1,300. And so we're seeing a lot of activity there. People are looking to buy horses and wanting to race because it just kind of makes sense to do so. One of the neat things about harness racing, I think, is that thoroughbred racing is the sport of kings. It's a wonderful sport. I made my living on that side of the industry for a good long while, and I'm still a fan. If thoroughbred racing is the sport of kings, then harness racing really is the sport of the people. There's a relatively low cost of entry. Day rates for horses to train are less. Sales prices tend to be a bit lower. There's a reasonable expectation of a return on investment in several jurisdictions, and I have a personal story to tell you about that in a moment. It's hands-on participation. Another thing that I think just really makes our sport very sellable. When I was a kid, I wanted to be a jockey. Didn't quite work out. Why are you laughing? No. No. Obviously, it did not work out. However, I am able to climb in a bike and with some training jog a racehorse. My wife is a 5th grade teacher. She has no horse background. I took this job with the USTA. She heard about the driving school that we have in which we actually teach people how they can enjoy the sport firsthand. And she hadn't found a teaching job yet. We just moved out there. So she had a little bit of free time and said, I want to do this. She did it. She got trained, and the next thing I know, she was negotiating with a trainer to go clean out stalls on the weekend so she could spend more time on the bike. I don't tell that to too many people. But at any rate, the next thing you know, we had a horse. And it goes from there. The breed is terrifically adaptable. You can train them to do just about anything. And they're very, very durable. The frequency and longevity of competition is such that our fans tend to get attached to horses because they see them race every week, because they can race every week. And I'll show you some stats on that. This is the percentage of horses number of horses who made starts in North America is the first column. Then the number that started between 30 and 35 times in that given year. So basically about 7% of the horses that start are going to race 30 to 35 times. Another 6% or so will race more than 35 times. They just keep going. And that's a reason why, despite the fact that our foal crops overall are relatively modest, we're able to compete and make as many starts as our thoroughbred brethren. Our average starts per year of our horses is a little over 17 right now. Reason that I kind of bring this up, and again, and this kind of ties into the participation and the economic side of the incentives, said that we got a horse. We did. We bought a claimer, a piece of a claimer with some friends. But the horse was racing at the Meadows in Pennsylvania, not in Ohio. I'm from Columbus. And the reason it was racing at the Meadows is because the purses at Ohio just made it such that it didn't make financial sense for us to keep the horse in Ohio. Well, the horse raced once and got claimed. Gail was disappointed because she didn't get to see the horse, didn't get to go out and touch the horse, wanted to feed the horse. I was like, good enough. You know, if they get claimed, that's all fine and good. And he wound up with a good home, and he did reasonably well. But about 4 or 5 months ago, a friend of ours came to us and said, there's an Ohio-bred yearling that I'm looking at, and would you and your wife like to be part of that? And Gail wanted to do it, and I said, well, let me take a look at this here. Ohio is installing the Racino model right now. Scioto Downs has already raised their purses. Northfield Park is building a Hard Rock casino that's attaching to it. And I looked at the Ohio-bred program for 2- and 3-year-olds, and it's very, very generous. I mean, there's some real opportunities to make money back. I looked at the number of horses in the foal crop, and it's going to shoot up next year, but for this 1 year, it's still somewhat small. The horses by a sire who had been standing in Indiana but has now relocated back to Ohio. So I thought, okay, this is pretty cool. Where's the horse going to be stabled? It was going to be stabled at the Delaware Fairgrounds. So now I have an opportunity to buy in at a relatively cheap price to actually see the horse on a weekly basis. Gail will probably jog him. And the business side of me looks at that and says, I got a reasonable chance of getting out on this horse and maybe even making a little money and having a whole lot of fun. So since then, we've recruited 2 partners who have not been involved in the game, but thought it would be a pretty cool thing and always wanted to own a racehorse and didn't know it was that easy. And we went through the prospectus with them. You know, my primary partner did. And to me, this is just one stupid story, and I don't mean to make this about me, and it's not about me. What it's about is putting incentives in place to encourage participation, because there is an audience out there. We just need to tell our story and make it attractive to them. I want to touch upon one thing that Matt talked about, and Commissioner McHugh, you asked a question regarding uniform rules and where was the pushback coming from. The USTA is in favor of uniform rules. We absolutely want to see that, and we share the Jockey Club's commitment to trying to research and prevent and deter people who would use substances that most impact the integrity of racing. Those illicit substances. And then Matt had mentioned something else, that one of their surveys said that 8 out of 10 people that they surveyed were concerned with illegal medications, and so are we. We differ a little bit in that we see our breed as being fundamentally different. and that some of the recommendations that came out of our MTC regarding withdrawal times, we felt prohibited our guys from using therapeutic medications that were important and humane in treating the standardbred athlete. So we're not part of an RMTC anymore, at least not for now. I look forward to continuing dialogue, but I wanted to make sure, and Matt was very generous, I think, in not throwing us under the bus per se, because I know that we disagree on this fundamental issue. But I wanted to put it right out there that we are in favor of uniform rules. We just think there should be a separate category for standardbreds because the breed, their needs, the number of times that they perform are fundamentally different. And so we'll be putting forth some recommendations of our own probably within the next couple of months. That's pretty much all I have for now, but I would welcome your questions, and I thank you so much for being such an attentive audience.
Thank you. I'd be interested in having you expand on the issue about the differences on the from the thoroughbreds. I would think that it would be a relatively objective fact about whether they should be subject to the same medication rules and lengths of time and so forth. Can you describe why is there a dramatic difference of opinion between the two regulatory bodies?
Sure, I can talk about this, and I know Alex can follow up and probably give a slightly different side of it. I'll give you two examples. Two of the substances that were discussed at our MTC were methylprednisolone, which is a corticosteroid, and clenbuterol, which is a bronchodilator. They're commonly used as therapeutics to treat horses between starts. The withdrawal times that were recommended, I think it was 14 days for clenbuterol. Was it 14 for methylpred and 21 for clenbuterol?
Other way around.
Yeah.
Would have basically taken those therapeutics right out of the hands of the standardbred horsemen. Our horses race largely every week. If you can't treat within 14 days or within 21 days, it's like not using it at all. The thoroughbreds, they tend to have more spacing between their starts. It would not affect them as much. Our horses, because they compete every week, we don't have a problem with catastrophic breakdowns. It just really doesn't happen in our sport, very, very rarely. But they do race hard every week. They do get aches and pains. They do get nicks and cuts. We've seen no evidence that methylprednisolone or clenbuterol is being misused in the standardbred community, and we felt that the attention was better used not necessarily on examining the therapeutics, but on going after substances like EPO and growth hormone and things like that that we see as being much more threatening.
Now, I'd be interested in your response to that, because that sounds like a fairly, like I said, an objective fact. They race much more frequently, therefore they don't have the amount of time to have the withdrawal. What's your reaction? Why do you see that as not something you would readily agree to?
So although you didn't intend to start a debate,
No,
I'm just teasing, Mike.
that's good.
No, our approach to this has been guided by the recommendations from the RMTC from the start. When we introduced our reform racing medication rules, which was basically a model rule book, we introduced that with a simple premise, and that was that fundamentally we believe that horses should only be allowed to compete when they're free from the influence of medication. That's kind of been the golden thread that courses through everything that we've done up to this point. We heard Mr. Langley make some very logical arguments, and Mike has echoed those arguments here today on frequencies of starts, just kind of the rigors of the race itself. We do disagree with them on the even the tacit tie to catastrophic breakdowns. that's a subject that still needs more research. We don't know what causes those. We've got a couple of epidemiologists that have been secured for the last 3 years that are studying what are the factors that actually drive that. So we're really not prepared to discuss any type of medication association to it. But at the end of the day, when we make our recommendations, and likewise when RMTC and RCI came out with theirs, we support the idea that there is somewhat of a bright line that's established between the use of these therapeutic medications for purposes of treating the heel and use of these medications for purposes to point a horse to a race. It's probably a philosophical difference more than anything. We realize that it is somewhat of a controversial position, but Mike and I have known each other for years. We love each other. We work together on so many issues, but it's really that fundamental. I don't mean to put words in your mouth, but I think it really boils down to that. And I'm not going to say that one position is right or wrong. I just don't think we can. There was too much research and too much intelligence that went into the position from the USTA for us to discount and to simply ignore. But from our perspective, it really gets to the fundamental purpose of treating a horse to heel versus treating a horse to race. And it's kind of within that area that we probably disagree.
Mr. Chairman, if I may, I would like to interject on behalf of the RMTC. That's the Racing Medication and Testing Consortium. And I think it's, first understand that this really isn't a debate between the Jockey Club and the USTA. This is really something that the Racing Medication and Testing Consortium determined after extensive research and analysis. All of the recommendations are based on science. And when the USTA presented its position to us at our last meeting, we agreed to relook at the science and to take another look at the science to make certain that how they use these two medication was a proper use of the medication and not an abuse that in some way led to either the safety or an integrity issue for horse racing. And we're in the process of doing that. We haven't completed that analysis yet. Once we do that, we'll come back perhaps with a modified recommendation that might in some way alleviate some of the tension. We don't know, but we are committed to looking at this from a scientific point of view. What we are not committed to doing is to modifying our rules based upon a perception that a business model needs to be accommodated. That is to say, if you're using clenbuterol that frequently or a corticosteroid that frequently, that may be for all well-intended, but it may have effects that aren't good for the horse or good for competition. And we have to determine that scientifically. And that's the way the Racing Medication and Testing Consortium is proceeding. So in good faith, we're continuing the dialogue. We're continuing to look at this issue. There'll be more to come. But for now, we respect the USTA. We want them back in the RMTC. We're going to look at this and see if we can come to terms. Ultimately, it becomes a question for commissions whether they want dual rules, perhaps. That may be the ultimate discussion. Right now, we're not inclined to allow, to recommend dual rules, one for each breed. But that's really something that's driven by the Racing Commissioners International, the RCI, and their values.
And if I just could step back just for a minute for educational purposes, because we've entered a realm that may be unfamiliar for some of the people in the room. I just want to take a minute to talk about how these rules come into effect. Because what we're talking about is rules that affect the participants in horse racing, but they start somewhere else. These aren't just rules that are determined, I go to the commission, I present them, they approve them, we put them in force. So what happens with medication regulations right now is they start out in committee level with the Racing Medication and Testing Consortium. Scientific Advisory Committee, there's a number of committees, and they look at that. So they're looking at the science. Those committee members make recommendations to the board of directors of the RMTC. And if they are approved at that point, then they are under consideration by Racing Commissioners International, which is a group of North American regulators. That has a model rules committee. The model rules committee listens to what the RMTC's recommendation is, takes that under consideration, speaks with the regulators. I can't speak to the RMTC committees, but I can speak to the RCI committees. We have conference calls that are epic, hours long. I was on the phone for 8.5 hours one day. That's a true story. And so the committees consider that. If it makes it out of the model rules committee, then it goes to the board of directors of RCI. If the RCI board of directors approves that, then at that point, I, as director of racing, would bring it forth to the commission, make the recommendation, this is the rule, and the commission would consider it for approval after the rulemaking process. And the rulemaking process in Massachusetts is something that you're all familiar with because that's just touching you. So I want to let you know that this is the culmination of several years of work, beginning at a very detailed level and rising to the level of this commission considering and adopting these rules. So I just want to take that overview for this group.
I think if you've been involved in racing for any amount of time, you're probably familiar that people don't always get along, and there's been too much disagreement in our sport. This is not a war. This is just a difference in opinion. I appreciate Matt's kind words. I have a great amount of respect for him and Alex. They're both very bright, very capable, committed guys. We both want to get to the same point. We just have different opinions at this point as to the road that we need to take to get there.
Can I ask a question, Mr. Tanner, about, you mentioned in 1986 there were tax reforms that had an effect on,
Yes.
on actual handle. We have a version of that going on in Massachusetts. Could you point out to what those reforms were? And
In a nutshell, it made it harder to write off business losses as a deduction for a stable. It made it less. There was less economic incentive for people to stay in the game or buy horses because it was harder to write it off as a business expense. I remember at the time, I was in college at the time, and I thought it was innocuous. But you take a look at the numbers after that, and I'm sure it shows the same thing on the thoroughbred side.
so it's also the same narrative of the ownership driving
Yes.
the industry, not the consumer necessarily.
Yes.
And I'm sorry, please go ahead.
Mr. McHugh?
No. A couple of your charts show the relationship between revenues and Racino purses and Racino participation.
Mm-hmm.
Is a standalone harness enterprise a viable business today?
It could be, but I think, and again, drawing on my own background, because when I was at Chester, it was married. I think from a racing perspective, my goal was always to expose as many people as possible to the sport. And I think our facility there did a really good job of integrating both. You could not go to the casino without seeing the racetrack. To me, that was preferable. That said, could a standalone work? I'm sure that it could.
Is the marriage between a casino and a track one that is viable and accelerates the revenue production because more people get exposed to the racing, or because the money from the casino flows into the purses, elevating the participation by the horsemen, regardless of how many people watch the sport, or a combination of both?
I think it's a combination of both. I mean, it's undeniable that the bulk of the purses that you saw on that chart are from casino sources in those states that have them. It certainly was the case when I was at Chester. We noticed some interesting phenomena, though. One was that when we would have a big day at the racetrack, we would drive business to the casino as well. My first year there, the president of the property was leery about us racing on Sunday afternoons because we had limited parking. And obviously you're trying to maximize your revenue, and in his mind that meant accommodating the casino folks before the racing patrons. We were able to show him pretty quickly that it was good for both sides when we had big days at the racetrack, and soon we began to kind of cross-market that way. I think it's there's less of a learning curve from a horse racing bettor to a casino bettor. I mean, you have to press a button or pull a lever, you know. Whereas there is, if you want to successfully handicap on racing, there's a vernacular and a jargon that has to be learned. For those of us that love puzzles, you know, that to me is just, you know, it's always been part of the appeal. It's a slightly slower pace. You have 15 or 20 minutes between races. It's more social. To me, I mean, obviously you can tell on which side of the question I lie, but there is crossover. There's more from racing into the casino than there is from the casino into racing, but it does occur.
Mm-hmm. Thank you.
You also mentioned Indiana and Pennsylvania. In some of the numbers you gave, it would appear that the handle was clearly a lagging indicator after the incentives kicked in with the approval of gaming.
It's slower. It takes a lot more time to develop handle over time. It used to be there was an adage. There was a very famous racing writer on the thoroughbred side named Joe Hirsch, and one of Joe's maxims, and he had many, was that good racing is good business. When I got to Chester, what we thought we'd do is, you know, we knew we were going to have fantastic purses in the second year, and we thought, you know what, we're going to be the new Meadowlands. We are going to go out and we are going to try to attract their drivers and their trainers by writing a program that would appeal to them. And it worked. It absolutely worked. And we got most of the biggest names in the sport to come race at our place. But the Meadowlands still continually outhandled us because it's a brand. It's been built up over time. And people are used to betting that. We saw gains year over year, and I understand those gains have continued there. But people like to bet what they're familiar with betting, and it takes time to convert them over to your product. Whereas in terms of attracting owners and breeders and things like that, much more economically driven. And if there are reasons to breed or race in a particular state, i.e. financial reward, then that's what they're going to do. They're businessmen.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.
I think what we'll do, since we're a little bit ahead of schedule here, is we'll take our 15-minute break right now.
Turn the system back on.
Are we live on the webcast? Okay. Finally this morning, it's my pleasure to introduce Mr. Alex Waldrop. He's President and Chief Executive Officer for the National Thoroughbred Racing Association. The NTRA is the thoroughbred industry's national office responsible for matters pertaining to federal legislative advocacy, racing safety and integrity, marketing and promotion of the sport, and improving the economic conditions for industry participants. The NTRA family includes the Safety and Integrity Alliance, a political action committee, and the NTRA Charities. Prior to joining the NTRA in 2006, Mr. Waldrop spent 13 years with Churchill Downs, first as general counsel, then president and general manager of the racetrack, and ultimately senior vice president of public affairs. He currently serves, as we've heard, as chair of the Racing Medication and Testing Consortium, a group which this commission gets to hear about from me ad nauseum. He's a trustee of the American Horse Council, an associate member of the International Masters of Gaming Law, and an advisor to the University of Arizona's Racetrack Industry Program. Mr. Waldrop holds a BA, an MA, and a JD.
Thank you, Dr. Derenberger, Chairman Crosby, members of the commission. It's a pleasure and an honor to be with you today to talk with you about federal issues important to horse racing. First, let me begin with a little bit of specificity about the NTRA. We're headquartered in Lexington, Kentucky, which is unusual for a national organization, but Lexington, as you know, is the center of thoroughbred breeding, and so it's the logical place for us to be. Nonetheless, our membership, I don't think I have a, I do not have a PowerPoint, sorry. I have no charts and graphs. You're gonna get, we've got a lot of ground to cover and this just slows down. So we're headquartered in Lexington, as I said, but we serve a diverse mix of racetracks, owners, breeders, trainers, and industry organizations. We're not a traditional trade association. We represent virtually every organization and every participant in horse racing. We will work closely with state regulators like this commission, with tracks and horsemen, to promote safe and fair racing through our NTRA Safety and Integrity Alliance. As you know, the Alliance has just recently re-accredited Boston's own Suffolk Downs. It was just last week, I believe, that we announced that. Our inspection team could not have given Suffolk Downs and the Massachusetts Gaming Commission staff higher marks for the safe and fair racing here in Boston. And you should know that, and you should understand that. Suffolk Downs is a model for this industry. And don't let anyone say otherwise in any debate that goes forward. It is done well here in Boston. Congratulations to Suffolk and its team for a job well done. NTRA has offices in New York City as well, and that's where we do our marketing and promotions efforts. But most importantly for today's discussions, we also have a staff in Washington, D.C., and that's where we headquarter our advocacy efforts for Congress. Dr. Dernberger has asked me to address 3 issues of national significance to the sport and the business of horse racing. First, we're going to talk about congressional interest in regulating horse racing. We're going to talk about federal and state tax withholding and the NTRA's efforts to clarify the calculation of pari-mutuel winnings for federal tax purposes. That's going to be fun. And we're going to talk about proposed federal legislation pertaining to internet gaming and its potential impacts on horse racing and pari-mutuel wagering. Each of these issues is critical to the future of horse racing in the United States, and you are well advised to be educating yourself on these matters today. The NTRA is very supportive of this forum because we believe that a local supervisory body such as this Massachusetts Gaming Commission, one that is well informed, well funded, and professionally staffed, is the best way to ensure the safety of our human and equine athletes and the integrity of our sport. So, thank you for inviting us. Let's start with the congressional interest in horse racing. It's undeniable that Congress is interested in our business and that, by and large, Congress's regulation of our sport has been measured and appropriate. In '78, Congress promulgated something called the Interstate Horse Racing Act. If you don't know anything about it, you're going to hear a lot about it from me. Probably heard a lot about it from Jennifer already. It was promulgated to regulate interstate wagering on horse racing. In so doing, Congress affirmed the proposition that the primary responsibility for the regulation of horse racing lies with the states where pari-mutuel wagering is conducted. As the IHA states right up front in its statement of findings and policies, and I quote, "The Congress finds that the states should have the primary responsibility for determining what forms of gambling may legally take place within their borders." End of quote. So Congress is happy to let states take the lead in matters pertaining to gambling. Nonetheless, Congress believes that it has a role to play in regulation of our sport. In Section 2 of that same statement, AHA, they say, quote, "The federal government should prevent interference by one state with the gambling policies of another and should act to protect identifiable national interests." Continuing in Section 3 of the statement, Congress says, "In the limited area of interstate off-track wagering and horse racing, there's a need for federal action to ensure states will continue to cooperate with one another in the acceptance of legal interstate wagering." So on the basis of these findings, the IHA grants to state regulators like yourself, tracks and horsemen, the legal authority to conduct interstate simulcasting and online advanced deposit wagering. Because of congressional action via this IHA, interstate wagering now accounts for nearly 90% of all wagering on horse racing. Let that sink in a little bit. 90% comes off the racetrack. So, the federal government does indeed play an important and effective role in regulation of interstate wagering on horse racing. Given this fact, it would be a mistake to categorically oppose any further federal regulation. Nonetheless, Congress has never successfully intervened further in horse racing's affairs. In 1981, Senator Mac Mathias proposed a legislation to establish a federal drug testing and enforcement agency for horse racing. But his committee was persuaded by the industry that we could handle these issues at the state level, so the bill never made it to the Senate floor. In fact, it's not until 2011 that another bill to regulate horse racing was introduced in Congress. That proposed regulation, known as the Interstate Horse Racing Improvement Act of 2011, was an ill-fated attempt to expand the scope of the Interstate Horse Racing Act to include the federal regulation of drugs and medications in racing. It made little progress in the 112th Congress, but a similar bill has been filed in the 113th Congress by Representatives Pitt and others in the House and by Senator Udall in the Senate. The bill is known as the Horse Racing Integrity and Safety Act of 2013. I'll refer to it in my remarks as HISA, H-I-S-A, in short. HISA takes a different approach, but the intent is the same: to promote safer, fairer racing by centralizing the regulation of drugs and medications in horse racing at the national level under the purview of the U.S. Anti-Doping Agency. HISA charges USADA with responsibility for developing rules with respect to both prohibited substances and practices, as well as controlled substances and methods. It also includes a ban on race day medications, including Lasix, after a 2-year transition period. And HISA also charges USADA with responsibility for anti-doping research, testing, and adjudication. HISA also charges USADA with developing rules, but it does not mandate even consultation with the racing industry. Last but not least, HISA subjects all interstate wagers to yet another consent right in addition to the consent rights already required by the Interstate Horse Racing Act, that being the consent of USADA. This has become a major sticking point for media and racing. So here's some of my observations and concerns about HISA. The NTRA respects the goals and intent of this legislation. Tough, fair, and most importantly, uniform regulation of drugs and medications in racing nationwide is the right goal. HISA has strong support from some segments of the business, including prominent owners, breeders, and even horse players. But there are problems, legal and political, that cannot be ignored. There are questions related to delegation of authority, a legislative authority. There are questions about federal preemption of state law. For instance, if HISA becomes law, what, if any, authority do states like Massachusetts have over horse racing in your jurisdictions? But beyond these significant legal issues that we'll leave for another day, HISA poses major political challenges that in some ways are more serious and more immediate. HISA has been and will continue to be opposed from within the racing industry by tracks and horsemen's groups because it would grant a private entity like USADA control over lucrative simulcasting and ADW rights without any assurance of legal recourse or political accountability. For these and other reasons, most federal lawmakers have taken no position relative to the bill. Congress itself has taken a hands-off approach. The fact is, Congress, like many state legislatures, has no interest in arbitrating horse racing's disputes. Rather than take up HISA in earnest, Congress would much rather prefer that our industry work out a consensus solution and bring it to Congress for enactment if necessary, which is exactly what happened when Congress promulgated the IHA. The industry drafted the Interstate Horse Racing Act. We brought it to Congress, and it's helped us ever since. That's what they want out of us. Tracks, horsemen, and state regulators are not going to agree to any delegation of current power to a private party, not USADA, not to the NTRA, not to any private organization. And Congress simply is not excited about imposing its will on unwilling industries. Are congressional hearings likely? Yes, possibility. But it's my expectation that at those hearings, the industry will have positive developments to report about our current uniformity efforts coming out of the RMTC and the RCI. We've talked about these two groups extensively already. Efforts that I'm happy to report are broadly supported and making real progress, not only here in Massachusetts and throughout the Mid-Atlantic, but with racing commissions nationwide. For the first time, we are making nationwide progress in the areas of tough, fair, uniform drug and medication regulation, multiple violator penalties, strict regulation of a single race day medication, namely Lasix, and RMTC lab accreditation. It's too early to say much, but we are optimistic that by early 2014, most major racing states will be fully on board with these critical reforms and a plan in place to bring the remainder of the states into uniform compliance. When we are successful in accomplishing these major reforms across the industry, there will be far less pressure from within the industry for federal intervention. Next, let's talk about another matter that significantly impacts horse racing: tax withholding on parimutuel winnings and the NTRA's efforts to minimize withholding's negative impacts on wagering. First, understand that taxation of horse player winnings is uncommon outside of the U.S., but the federal government takes it a step further. The IRS not only taxes winnings, but also requires that racetracks withhold taxes from parimutuel winnings under certain circumstances. This withholding is detrimental to racing because it takes money out of the hands of players who otherwise would rebet or churn their winnings. Lower churn means less wagering. Lower wagering means reduced parimutuel revenue to fund the business and the taxes that they pay. And then the strangest of ironies, the lower handle that results from withholding also hurts government, ultimately lowering its total cumulative tax receipts from gamblers. And candidly, this is a matter of unusual importance in Massachusetts because your horse players also suffer from perhaps the most onerous withholding tax structure in the United States. And I don't say that lightly. As you know, starting last June, horse players in Massachusetts who are paid winnings of $600 or more by Massachusetts racetracks are subject to an immediate, non-refundable 5% tax, which is withheld from winnings. The state tax burden on horse players is in addition to an already burdensome federal withholding of 25%, which takes place on popular multi-horse and multi-race exotic bets such as trifectas and pick sixes. And don't forget that the parimutuel system, in that system, winnings are already reduced by state excise taxes paid by operators out of the takeout. These federal and state tax policies are burdensome, they are unfairly applied, and they're counterproductive. Let me explain that. Tax withholding on winning parimutuel wagers is burdensome because it bears no relationship to the actual winnings of horse players, who often stake large sums of money in hopes of hitting a single winning ticket. Under the current IRS withholding rules, federal withholding applies to winning tickets when the winning payoff exceeds $5,000 and is at least 300 times as large as the amount wagered. And that phrase, amount wagered, is critical to this discussion. To determine the amount wagered, the IRS treats the amount paid for the one winning combination as the only amount wagered, even though the entire cost of the typical exotic wager is much higher due to the high number of potential combinations. Now, I'm not going to go into lots of detail, but I've submitted a letter to you that explains the math of the situation in greater detail, and I've used in that situation the 7-horse exacta box. So I commend that letter to you for further analysis of this specific issue. For this morning's purposes, suffice it to say that the IRS's way of withholding on parimutuel payouts shows a basic misunderstanding of the way our game is played and the risks that horse players take. Perhaps it's due to the fact that the current rule has been in place for more than 35 years at a time when exotic wagering was really fairly uncommon, in fact even unheard of. Also, unlike federal law, which provides a mechanism for possible federal tax withholding refund by allowing a bettor to offset any taxable parimutuel winnings with parimutuel losses on the taxpayer's annual tax return, Massachusetts appears to provide no such mechanism for a state tax refund. Thus, the Massachusetts law unfairly taxes winnings, but ignores losses. This policy does nothing but raise the price of betting on horse racing at a time when this industry and its patrons cannot afford price increases. Federal withholding also unfairly discriminates against horse players. This is because no form of casino gambling is subjected to IRS withholding. Understand this point. Racetrack, we withhold 25%. Casino, no problem, it's your money. Withholding is applied only to pari-mutuel winnings. This is simply unfair to horse racing. And we wonder why players tend to abandon horse racing in favor of casino games. For big players, it's an easy discussion. It's an easy decision. Your Massachusetts tax on winnings discriminates as well. At any eventual Massachusetts racino, where racing and gaming are both taking place, the tax will apply to horse players, but not to card players in the casino. Frankly, this is outrageous. And for this reason alone, the Massachusetts tax must be eliminated. Tax withholding is also counterproductive for government. Studies show that each pari-mutuel dollar returned to bettors in the form of winnings is rebet 7 times. Yes, I said that, 7 times. Throughout the course of the race day. Pari-mutuel churn is dramatically diminished by the automatic 25% federal withholding on winnings, and further by the 5% tax on those same winnings, as we've already said. Diminished churn will inexorably lead to the lower handle, which means receipts for federal government in Massachusetts will be reduced. In the long run, government loses more than it gains. So to counteract this problem, at least at the federal level, the NTRA has been working with the IRS to find relief from the application of federal tax withholding to our wagering business. Of course, we've attempted to repeal the provision entirely. Difficult to do in an environment where Congress is willing to hang on to every tax dollar he can possibly find. We're asking the service to reconsider its longstanding interpretation of the phrase amount wagered, and instead take into account the total amount wagered by the recipient of the winning proceeds into the pari-mutuel pool from which the proceeds are paid. If I spent $25 on that 7-horse exacta box, that $25 ought to be considered the amount wagered, but that's not the way the federal government does. You won on a $1 combination. That was the minimum wager. So they considered a $1 bet, not a $25 bet. That's got to change, and that's where we're advocating the amount wager has to be every dollar that goes into that pool. This doing so would reflect the true cost of a wager and eliminate about 80% of withholding under current law. I have no progress to report on this front, but we will keep forcing the issue with the service. We'll continue to lobby Congress for complete elimination of withholding, all the reasons I've mentioned. As I've said, a similar change is needed in Massachusetts. The 5% tax must be eliminated, or your Massachusetts tracks and casinos, mostly tracks, will be at a competitive disadvantage with the many well-established casinos in surrounding states. This is bad tax policy. It's also, frankly, very bad business. You're putting yourself in a very difficult position vis-a-vis a very competitive gaming environment in the Northeast. So, 2/3 of the way through. Now I'm ready to talk about the proposed federal legislation pertaining to internet gaming and its potential effects on horse racing. First, some background on online wagering. Racing has had a strong interest in online wagering since at least 2000, when the NTRA helped to secure passage of an amendment to the IHA to authorize internet and account wagering for horse racing. That change opened up online markets for horse racing, and led to some of that 90% number that we talked about earlier. And today, the top priority for the NTRA legislative team in Washington is to ensure that Suffolk Downs' ability to legally offer interstate simulcasting and advanced deposit wagering is protected under federal law. That gives Suffolk a real competitive advantage because, you see, unlike wagering on horse racing, interstate online casino gambling is prohibited by federal law. Think back to the year 2011, when several offshore operators were arrested in the U.S. in connection with sites like Full Tilt Poker and PokerStars. Some account holders are still trying to get their money back from those groups. These companies and their officers were prosecuted under federal statutes for allegedly allowing U.S. citizens to illegally access their online poker sites. These high-profile prosecutions spurred players to urge Congress to pass federally regulated online casino gaming. Most casino companies, including many of the big casinos in Las Vegas, support a tax and regulate approach to online gaming so long as there are uniform regulations and strong consumer protections. The champion of this approach has been none other than Senate Majority Leader Harry Reid from Nevada. Not a bad friend to have in the U.S. Congress. Let's just hope he gets the job done today and stops the craziness that's happening in Washington. To date, no online gaming bill has moved through the Congress, but it has not been for lack of effort. Several members of Congress have worked closely with the casino industry and poker players to craft federal online gaming legislation. In the current Congress, 2 bills are pending, one sponsored by Representative Peter King of New York and one by Texas Representative Joe Barton. Surprisingly, there's been very little action on these or any other federal bills for iGaming, and that's been the case for some time. And frankly, it appears to be little chance of any movement on the federal level, at least for now. Why do I say this lack of progress is surprising? Well, because an important event happened in 2011 that presaged a major expansion of online gaming, especially at the federal level. In late 2011, the U.S. Department of Justice reversed its long-held position on the legality of internet gambling by issuing an opinion that essentially exempted casino gaming from the reach of the Wire Act. Got another act I've thrown at you here. It's another important federal act. It was passed in 1961. It's a criminal law which historically has been relied upon by the Department of Justice to prohibit any form of online wagering, including casino gaming. One exception to the Wire Act prohibition is the IHA, which secures for us the right to conduct our interstate online ADW wagering. That's why the IHA is so important to racing. With this reversal by the DOJ, it was the opinion of many that at a minimum, online poker would explode nationally. Now, the DOJ opinion specifically paved the way for intrastate online lotteries in New York and Illinois. But the DOJ also created a clear path for states to regulate online casino gaming intrastate, which simply means online games among those citizens located within the borders of the regulating state. Groups like Poker Players Alliance were ecstatic at the idea of legal poker and its expansion. And there was also speculation that the prospect of online gaming expansion at the state level would prompt Congress to preempt state expansion by passing federal legislation legalizing and regulating interstate online poker while simultaneously prohibiting all forms of online casino gaming at the state level. In a strange twist, some of the most ardent anti-gaming folks in Congress were willing to take that route to limit expansion. Federal preemption is the preferred route of the big casinos in Las Vegas and the American Gaming Association. They say they want to avoid a patchwork of state laws and regulations in the online arena. But here we sit 2 years later, nothing has happened at the federal level. In fact, Harry Reid, who's, as I stated earlier, is the primary proponent, recently all but declared all efforts to legalize poker at the federal level dead. And the new AGA chief, a guy named Jeff Freeman, agreed with Reid's assessment at the AGA's Global Gaming Expo last month. Nonetheless, he said that they will continue to push for a federal solution to online gaming. What has stopped Reid and the AGA? Well, I think at least 4 things have stopped them, if not more. One, the Council of State Governments got very involved. They didn't like the idea of federal gaming because they wanted to secure revenue, and they didn't want to hurt revenues that, like you're going to be getting from your own brick and mortar properties here in the state. State lotteries don't like it because they want that exclusive right to conduct these online lotteries. Native American tribes have billions in brick and mortar facilities in tribal lands across the country. They certainly don't want to see an online move into their area. And social conservatives in Congress, who you would expect also have opposed the expansion. So the lack of federal action has meant that since 2011, all the action has been at the state level. But states have also been slow to act, and their business prospects have been hampered by the small-scale operations. The states of Nevada, Delaware, and New Jersey have each legalized intrastate web gambling. Again, that's among only their state residents. And players located within the borders of Nevada are already able to play on a couple of state-regulated sites. It's up and running already. Delaware will be up and running with a target launch of the 31st of this month, they say. And New Jersey hasn't scheduled a launch, but they have a statutory deadline of November 26th. That changes every day. It changes by the hour. I may already be wrong about that. The real questions remain about the size of these three relatively small state markets and the lack of sufficient liquidity or churn, there's that word again, to make these states' online gaming sites competitive. You need a lot of players to make these sites work. In particular, the concern is whether they will be competitive with the illegal offshore sites. While no one knows for sure the size of the illegal gaming market, online gaming market in the U.S., it's been estimated at about $2.6 billion annually, which is down from a high of about $5.6 billion before the prosecutions. When it was at its highest in 2010, we engaged a company to give us the estimated impact of illegal online gaming on horse racing. And at that time, we concluded that the impact was about $50 million a year in lost revenue to tracks and horsemen. So online gaming does affect horse racing. To become more competitive, Nevada, New Jersey, and Delaware are already looking at ways to combine their efforts through interstate compacts, which might allow them to combine efforts which would increase liquidity, and attract more action, get more play. Another approach, which is interesting, is to allow citizens from non-gaming states to cross borders via cyberspace and participate in online games offered in Nevada, New Jersey, or Delaware, states which already have invested heavily in these complex regulatory and licensing structures. This would allow states to move quickly and inexpensively, yet enjoy the benefits of new revenue through cross-border partnership agreements. The big states like California and Illinois are currently considering whether to join Nevada, New Jersey, and Delaware in this intrastate online arena, but there are obstacles in these two states and no guarantee that either will legalize anytime soon. Other states have tried and failed, Massachusetts being one of those. You may know more about that than I do, but based upon my information, most recently it's not happening. Hawaii tried it, Iowa, Kansas, Mississippi, New York, Pennsylvania, Texas, Florida, Louisiana, Washington. There's a lot of interest out there. It just hasn't worked yet. That expansion that we expected is moving a lot slower than we thought, and its impact is less dramatic. Unfortunately, that means the impact on legal domestic online gaming on racing's ADWs and its brick and mortar operations has been less impacted than we thought so far. But we don't expect states to delay forever. In fact, we expect that eventually the number of states offering intrastate poker online and other casino games will grow much larger. We do not anticipate the passage of a federal bill allowing casino gaming anytime soon. Probably what Congress is going to do is, for the near term, continue to kick the issue of gambling back to the states to decide, as we talked about earlier. It's generally their policy. Something they may do eventually is a legislation akin to the Interstate Horse Racing Act, a sort of Interstate Poker Act, meaning legislation that would clearly legalize interstate poker, interstate online poker, or casino games, as long as such online games are legal and regulated in both states involved. That would be good for online operators. It wouldn't be good for horse racing's online business or our brick and mortar businesses either. Because any online expansion will negatively impact racing, and Massachusetts horse racing should be compensated for that impact. For that reason, I've spoken recently, and I've encouraged the horse racing industry in Massachusetts to engage with lawmakers, with this commission, and others to protect racing's interest in any online gaming bill. I can assure you that the NTA will continue doing the same with respect to any federal bill that legalizes online gaming. So let me conclude with these thoughts. Thank you for your attention, and I commend you for your commitment to learn about this crazy business of horse racing. Be aware that Congress is unlikely to intervene in Massachusetts if we can get together other states to follow your lead with respect to uniform medication, penalties, and testing reforms. Stay involved. Urge regulators in other states outside the Mid-Atlantic and the Northeast to follow your lead. Horse players will bet more on Massachusetts horse racing, and Massachusetts will net more in excise taxes if we can find a way to limit or eliminate federal and/or state tax withholding on pari-mutuel wagers in this state. Elimination of withholding is a priority for the NTRA, and it should be a priority for this commission. And finally, new competition for Massachusetts horse racing is coming in the form of legal online casino gaming. Be vigilant. Give racing a seat at the table. Make sure that any Massachusetts online gaming is structured in a way that is fair to horse racing, does not unduly harm the jobs and economic activity that racing supports. I thank you for your attention, and if there's time, I'll take questions now.
Plenty of time.
Question, sir.
Yes.
Has Delaware or New Jersey done anything to compensate when they legalized online gaming?
New Jersey has not. In fact, horse racing made attempts, but there's nothing in the bill in New Jersey. I honestly don't know the answer to Delaware's question, but tracks in Delaware already have brick and mortar casinos. I think they have the opportunity to be in the business if they so choose, but I'm not aware of any specific carve-outs for horse racing in that bill either. And of course, in Nevada, there is no horse racing.
You mentioned that there is some initial stages of some states getting some compacts relative to these interstate internet.
Yes.
Wagering, poker. Wouldn't the DOJ have some kind of interpretation relative to the Wire Act if that were to happen?
Well, that's a great question, and the Wire Act is not the only prohibition against interstate wagering. In fact, the Wire Act, one of the things that the DOJ opinion said was that the Wire Act doesn't apply to casino gaming. But there are other acts that apply to casino gaming that prohibit cross-border gambling into areas where it's not legal. The compact, it's being argued, would override or circumvent some of these legal impediments. Let me say, the poker, the 2011 prosecutions, they weren't under the Wire Act. They were under a whole other set of regulations. Okay. And so the compact would satisfy those legal impediments, and it would allow them to go interstate. That would be the argument. I'm sure the Department of Justice would argue otherwise, because they do. The Department of Justice is very aggressive on these things. Whether they would prosecute or stop it, that's another question. I suspect that if two states entered into a legal compact, they would not intervene.
I want to talk to you a second about the withholding bit. I understand and agree with the idea of having the net, the gross bet be deducted from the gross winnings rather than this silly, the way it is now. But if you're going to tax something, why isn't withholding a perfectly legitimate means of ensuring that you collect the tax?
Well, you're right. Withholding applies in a variety of contexts. The point about horse racing, a couple of points. One, by withholding in the middle of the event, you're damaging the event itself. You're in effect getting involved in undermining the integrity of the integrity is not the problem, the economic integrity of the event, because people need that money to rebet. So for the reason I said, it's counterproductive. You can do that, but you're not going to get any more money in the long run, because we still report. I didn't even talk about reporting. Reporting starts much sooner. And it's a very effective way of making people pay taxes. You simply collect the information and you report it to the federal government. We do that every day. In fact, many, many more people report than do withhold. So there's plenty of ways for the government to get at the funds. Withholding somehow suggests that gamblers are less honest, that they're not going to pay their taxes. I don't really know. We don't withhold in every situation. We do some for the convenience for my convenience. My employer withholds my taxes. I control that myself, but it's really as much for my convenience as for the government's convenience. But doing it in the context of horse racing, I think suggests that horse players are dishonest. They're not going to pay their taxes eventually, when in fact they're going to be reported, and they're going to step up, and they're going to be able to pay those taxes. The other point, I didn't get into this, and it's a very complicated technical point, but many times once that money is taken by the federal government, even though ultimately a player can show through his losses that he made no money that year, the government keeps every nickel of it, because in order to get those losses back, you have to file the long form of 1040, and certain deductions get kicked out if you fall into alternative minimum tax range. If you've ever been in that heck of a place to be, you don't want to be there, but once you get there, you lose the ability to offset your losses against your winnings. And so some of our players pay these taxes even though they don't owe them. And the government's like, that's your problem, buddy, not mine. I got the money, come try to get it from me now. And that happens frequently. So it overtaxes our players, it distrusts our players. There are better ways of calculating the value through reporting and not withholding. And it's ultimately counterproductive, because you're going to see less revenue from that because you're taking money out of circulation. We suspect that on Derby Day, some $10 million comes out of circulation on that one day alone from withholding. And if that money were rebet, that'd be almost $70 million in handle. And the taxes that would inure to the government from that are significant. But that just underscores the short-term thinking that's involved.
Is there any data to support that deals with the shortfall or deals with the percentage of taxes that are in fact paid by gamblers who have had their winnings reported, as opposed to other forms of taxation?
Yes, the IRS keeps that information. They know exactly who's paying what and who's not paying and how this money is flowing. We can get that for you. I don't know how much detail we could do that. It would take some time. The IRS has to open back up, I guess. I don't know if they're closed or not. I suspect they are. So it may lose a little ground there, but I'd be happy to find what I can about that information. We have actually delved into that with them. They understand the problem. Believe me, the IRS understands our position. And I think if it were within their ability to make the change, they would. But because of the size and the amount of money we're talking about here, the tens of millions of dollars, the actual legislation that we introduced some years ago that would eliminate withholding was scored by the Government Accounting Office, which is done in the federal ranks. Whenever you submit a piece of legislation, it has to be scored, which is to say, what's the impact on the Treasury? And this impact was in the hundreds of millions of dollars over 10 years, which surprised us that it was that large. But it just tells you how much they think it's worth to them as a government. Now, we frankly think that part of that is because they lose interest that's paid on the money. Part of it's because so many of our players can't get it back because of alternative minimum, or don't because they don't know how, or don't have the record keeping. And so it's a windfall for the federal government. And what little they do keep would have gotten from regular taxation anyway. But yes.
Well, I'd welcome whatever data
Okay,
you can
well,
provide.
I'll talk to you afterwards, and we'll talk a little bit more about what you think you need, and we'll see if we can go get it.
Are there, you said you'd like, in the case of internet gambling, you'd like to have the horse racing industry be at the table and have mitigation efforts. What are the mitigation efforts? What would those, besides just paying money, like we've done in Massachusetts, some of the casino revenues are going to go to a racehorse development fund. Are there other strategies?
Well, the first thing I would do if I were at the table, I'd say get rid of the 5% tax, period, right now. That's off the table. That's the number one thing on the table. Until that's off, we're going to oppose everything you do. I'd also look at other legislation that would be positive to the industry that would be concluded at the federal level, for instance. we included a reporting withholding. We also got some additional concessions from the Department of Justice on certain online gaming conduct, and we finally got a share of the tax revenues that came, or they agreed, they didn't pass anything, obviously, but we attempted to get some funds to mitigate. So if there were taxes being paid by the online groups, some percentage of that money would come back, just like you see the brick and mortar casinos sending money to racetracks in the form of purses and revenues. Why? Because you're essentially taking a market away from racing. You're essentially acquiring that market, a market that they have, that exists, and they've been in that space for some time, and to take it from them without giving it is unjust. It's unconstitutional. Something has to be paid for that market, whether it's online or brick and mortar. And it's perpetual. It's not just here today. It's not just here a year from today. It needs to be ongoing and long term. Not like you see in Ontario in Canada, where 5 years into the experiment, well, never mind. You've done a great job for us, but we're going to take it over now. We're going to take your market from you. That's
How is it different from if a state permits online retailing, which is going to take revenues away from bricks and mortar retailing? We don't ask the online retailers to return some money to the bricks and mortar retailers. What? I mean, isn't it just the world we live in? You know, if somebody prefers to put their money into online gaming than horse racing, that's the competitive world we live in. Such is life.
one major difference, one very major difference. Horse racing is a regulated market. You regulate the market of horse racing. You decide who is in the market, who's not, who can't be in the market, what their market is. So you limit access to that market so that you can maximize revenues to Suffolk Downs and to the, I can't think of the harness track that's here. So you can maximize revenues to those tracks. You're responsible for those two permit holders, and you can't do something to harm them if you're limiting them, or if you're creating that you're not allowing other people in because of the I would say the vulnerability of that market to competition. That's why you are here, to make sure that you conduct it in a way, or that you conduct horse racing in a way that maximizes its benefits to jobs, economic activity.
But we regulate public utilities. We regulated the telephone industry.
Right.
And when there were competitors with the telephone industry, we didn't tax the competitors to the telephone industry to pay them back for the business they were losing when they were new.
Well, you're getting a little bit outside of my area of expertise, but I think still in those cases, there are limits on how many competitors can come into the market. I'm thinking of Kentucky, where there are just a handful of entrants in the market there, and because I don't think that's the case on the cell phone market, but on the landline market, it's a little different. I'm going to stop there before I say something I know nothing about.
All right. Well, it's philosophically interesting, you know, I'm sympathetic to the point you're making, but I don't want to just be defending something because, you know, we're committed to this industry. It's got to be philosophically consistent with the way we treat other industries in order to have a chance of actually working.
Think of it this way. You as a commissioner are in a unique position to oversee all gaming that occurs in this state, whether it's online, brick and mortar, racing, whatever. It's incumbent on you to make sure that the mix of those three does not unduly damage the other. They have to coexist. And that's part of your charge, I presume, is to be a partner, is to make sure they coexist. And if one partner is going to be severely disadvantaged by the introduction of a new competitor, you have got to take that into consideration long term in terms of the viability of one of those partners. That's the way I would say it. No other, that's a very unique charge, but it's because of the unique nature of gambling and the way we as a society view it, and your charge is to make sure that it's done all the right ways, in all the right places, and it's regulated and overseen, and it's fair, and it's safe. and it falls to your shoulders to make sure that it's economically viable too, because if it's not viable, it goes away, and then you lose the jobs and the economic benefit and the stature that racing brings to the state of Massachusetts.
Following up on something that Steve said, that most of the major brick and mortar retailers also have an online presence, and in fact, the online component is changing the business model for some of them, in a dramatic way. Has any state explored the possibility of allowing a track to have its races and pari-mutuel activity available over the internet?
Well, absolutely.
I mean,
That's
just
today.
so I could do it on my mobile device.
Yes, absolutely. I haven't been to Suffolk Downs, but come to Keeneland, come to most of the major racetracks. Absolutely, you can wager online. We have TVG, which is one of the primary distributors. You've got HRTV, which is another distributor. You've got twinspires.com. There are many, many, many ADW companies that will provide you a chance to watch and wager from anywhere, mobile device, assuming you're in a place which is considered to be legal under the Interstate Horse Racing Act. Absolutely. I mean, that's the sort of thing that racing has today. That's what we do that nobody else can do. That's the very sort of unique form of wagering that we have and distinguishes us from certainly every sport and other form of wagering right now, with the exception today of what's happening in Nevada, where you can do some casino gambling online in Nevada. So that's the point. You're doing something today. You're allowing Suffolk and to do something online that's very unique. It's very important to their business. And if you allow someone else to come into that market as the regulator of that market, there has to be an allowance for the group that's already in there, because in the process you can't undermine those existing permit holders that are there today. I'm not saying you give them carte blanche and you don't allow competitors in, but if you do it in a way that allows everyone to coexist. Otherwise, you're going to lose racing. Hey, just a second, I just want, are there any other questions from the commissioners? Yes, sir.
How, are we coming anywhere out of the countryside with that? Excuse me. Do we see anything coming out of the country simulcasting to horsemen here? From what I understand, I don't know if we got anywhere, but I'm afraid of a Breeders' Cup going to London or a Breeders' Cup going to Hong Kong. And I'm looking at the revenues that would be generated for the industry or the horsemen in this country. Do we have any, are you doing any work on out of the country simulcasting revenues to be split with horsemen in this country?
I think your question is, if the Breeders' Cup or any other is simulcasting internationally, are we, the NTRA, doing anything to make sure that horsemen in this country get a piece of that interstate simulcasting revenue? I can say we are not, the NTRA is not involved in those discussions. Those are commercial discussions between operators, tracks, and horsemen. I think the group that's best positioned to control that would be the horsemen in the location where that racing is occurring. For instance, when it comes to the Breeders' Cup in a couple of weeks, the money that is generated from the interstate simulcasting comes back to the participants in the Breeders' Cup racing in the form of additional purses. That's part of the entire negotiation among the various parties to that arrangement. I'm not sure that there are other tracks that have significant interstate, international wagering, but if they do, I'm certain that those local horsemen have a stake in that in the
I'm just trying to
negotiation.
find everything you said, I kind of know, but I'm trying to find out if there was an area of direction where we could go to find out more about it. I just thought you might know, as a husband in this country now, worrying about the extreme loss of revenue from ATMs and everything else that's taking a big part of our industry away, looking to try to get any other new avenues of revenue before we have that taken out. No initiative now to get involved with that? What direction would we take as Horsemen trying to get involved with that ourselves? Where would we go?
Well, you're asking me where horsemen should go to get more revenue out of wagering. And I think especially when you've got so many new ways of distributing horse racing. Because what we're talking about here is sort of a good problem. It's a success problem. In the old days, horse racing happened 80 days a year at Suffolk Downs, and if you wanted to bet horse racing, you had to come to Suffolk Downs. Then we had simulcasting, which meant that you could come to Suffolk on an off day, and you could bet on racetracks from across the country. And that diluted on-track attendance. People came throughout the year. People started saying racing dying, and not understanding that what was happening was racing was expanding. Which is why you asked a question earlier about attendance. Attendance is the worst model. It's the worst. It is live attendance at the racetrack is the worst indicator of the health of horse racing. And it's why many tracks no longer even report it. Because 90% of the people who are betting on that race that day are somewhere else. They're not there. In the old days, they were all came there. But today, we're not like football. We're not like other sports where you have to be there. That's probably not a great example, but you can enjoy, you can participate directly in the economics of horse racing from anywhere in the country if you're in a location that allows either simulcasting or ADW wagering. And that for you is the challenge, is to get a bigger piece of that money, that wagering that's occurring remotely from the live track. And all I can say there is that many of us have been concerned for some time that the ADWs, which are content companies, they distribute the product online. Some are racetracks, many are not. And there is a constant tension between all the groups that the distributors are taking more out of the pot than, that they're taking more than they're generating in terms of additional new handle. And that's a constant back and forth. We're not involved in those negotiations. Those kinds of commercial arrangements are conducted via the Interstate Horse Racing Act at the very local level between track and horsemen. And there really is no national table where that occurs.
If there are no other questions, it's high noon, so we could adjourn for lunch, if that's...
And convene again at?
And convene again at 1 o'clock, if I'm permitted to say that. Mr. Chair, if you need to say that. We've both said it for the record. All right. Thank you all for coming. Those of you that can't stay this afternoon, these are some heavy hitters. Real privilege to have them here.